quiet winter settles over the United States. Snow blankets small towns. Smoke rises from chimneys. Rivers move slowly beneath thin ice. Life appears ordinary, calm, uninterrupted. In the winter of 1860, the United States was still at peace. No cannons had fired. No soldiers had marched into battle. The image subtly darkens. The camera lingers on frozen ground, cracked by cold. Old maps of the nation fade in, their borders beginning to feel fragile. And yet, the nation was already coming apart. The scene shifts indoors. Dimly lit convention halls across the South, groups of men sit at long wooden tables. Papers are unfolded. Pens hover, then move. Decisions are made in low voices. Across the South, state leaders gathered in quiet convention halls, not to debate policy, but to decide whether the Union itself could survive. Printing presses begin to turn. Newspapers roll out, headlines sharp and anxious. Ink-stained hands stack fresh pages. Newspapers warned of disaster. The setting changes to modest homes. Families sit around dinner tables, faces tense. Conversations grow strained. Someone pushes back a chair. Silence follows. Families argued at dinner tables. Inside churches, congregations sit divided. Hymns echo, but eyes avoid one another. Pews that once felt united now feel separated by invisible lines. Churches once united began to divide. A portrait of Abraham Lincoln appears, then fades into empty government buildings in Washington. The Capitol stands still, waiting. Abraham Lincoln had been elected president, but he had not yet taken office. Time seems suspended. Clocks tick loudly. Empty streets. Flags hang motionless. The country was frozen in a dangerous pause, caught between democracy and disunion. The camera returns to the map. Lines are traced, then erased. Two visions of the nation overlap and pull apart. Some Americans believed secession was a constitutional right. Others saw it as rebellion, a final stillness. The map stops changing. Everyone understood one thing clearly. Once the Union fractured, there would be no easy way back. Darkness settles in. Not the chaos of battle, but the weight of an irreversible choice. This was not the start of a war. It was something more unsettling. The screen fades slowly to black. It was the moment Americans stopped asking how to compromise and began asking whether the United States should exist at all. The breaking point came not with violence, but with a vote. On November 6, 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected the 16th President of the United States. He won decisively in the Electoral College, yet his name was absent from ballots in much of the South. In 10 Southern states, Lincoln received not a single electoral vote. To many Southerners, this result was more than a political loss. It was proof that their influence within the Union had reached its end. For decades, Southern leaders had relied on a fragile balance, equal representation in Congress, compromises over new states, and the protection of slavery where it already existed. Lincoln's election shattered that balance. For the first time, a president had been elected entirely by Northern and Western votes, without any meaningful Southern support. What frightened the South was not an immediate threat. Lincoln had promised not to abolish slavery where it already existed, but he was clear about one thing: slavery would not be allowed to expand into new territories. To slaveholding states, this position carried a deeper implication. If slavery could not expand, it would eventually lose political power. And if it lost power, its future within the Union was uncertain. Southern newspapers reacted with urgency and alarm. Editorials warned that the South had become a permanent minority in a nation now dominated by Northern interests. Political leaders argued that remaining in the Union meant accepting policies shaped by people who neither understood nor respected Southern society. In this climate of fear, the language of compromise faded. In its place rose the language of survival. Secession, once a distant theory, now felt immediate and necessary to many Southern elites. They argued that the states had voluntarily joined the Union and therefore retained the right to leave it. They pointed to the Constitution, claiming it was a compact between sovereign states, not an unbreakable national bond. In the North, reactions were very different. Many Northerners saw Lincoln's victory as a triumph of democratic process. An election had been held. The people had voted. To them, talk of secession felt reckless, even dangerous, yet few fully grasped how deep the Southern resolve had become. Between November and December, the tension intensified. Public meetings were held across the South. Secession conventions were proposed. Militia groups began quietly organizing, preparing for a future that still seemed unimaginable, but increasingly possible. Meanwhile, the federal government stood still. President James Buchanan remained in office, but his influence was weak. He believed secession was unconstitutional, yet also believed the federal government lacked the authority to prevent it. This contradiction left the nation without direction at its most critical moment. Lincoln, still weeks away from his inauguration, watched events unfold from Illinois. He said little publicly, aware that every word could inflame the crisis further. America was now suspended in uncertainty. The election had ended. The consequences had only begun. South Carolina moved first, but it did not move suddenly. For decades, the state had stood at the front of Southern resistance to federal authority. It had challenged tariffs. It had threatened secession before. And long before 1860, many of its leaders had come to believe that separation from the Union was not a question of if, but when. Lincoln's election removed the final hesitation. In December 1860, South Carolina called a special convention in Charleston. Delegates arrived knowing their decision in advance. The debate was brief, not because the issue lacked weight, but because minds were already made up. On December the 20th, 1860, the convention voted unanimously to secede from the United States. The announcement was met with celebration in the streets of Charleston. Church bells rang, cannons fired in salute, flags were raised where the United States flag had once flown. South Carolina declared that it was no longer bound by the federal Constitution. Shortly after, the state issued a formal document explaining its decision. Titled, "The Declaration of the Immediate Causes Which Induce and Justify the Secession of South Carolina," it left little room for interpretation. The document named slavery repeatedly. It accused northern states of failing to enforce laws protecting slaveholders. It claimed that the election of a president opposed to the expansion of slavery threatened the very foundation of Southern society. This was not a vague statement about abstract principles. It was direct, specific, and unmistakable. South Carolina had seceded to protect slavery. The decision sent shockwaves across the nation. In the North, disbelief turned quickly into alarm. Many had assumed that secession threats were political theater, tools meant to extract concessions. Now, the threat had become reality. In the South, South Carolina's action emboldened others. Political leaders in neighboring states praised the move. Newspapers framed it as an act of courage and self-defense. Calls for unity among Southern states grew louder. At the same time, uncertainty spread. Not every Southerner supported secession. Small farmers, merchants, and those without enslaved laborers questioned the wisdom of leaving the Union. Some feared war, others feared economic isolation. But the momentum had shifted. The federal government faced a dilemma with no clear solution. Several U.S. forts, arsenals, and customs houses now sat inside a state that claimed to be independent. South Carolina demanded control of them. Federal officials refused. Yet no force was used. President Buchanan, still in office, avoided confrontation. He hoped compromise might still be possible. But compromise required time, and time was running out. South Carolina had crossed a line. The Union was no longer whole. And once the first state left, the question was no longer whether others would follow, but how many. South Carolina's decision did not stand alone for long. Within days, political leaders across the Deep South began preparing to follow the same path. What had once seemed radical now felt inevitable. Mississippi moved next. On January 9, 1861, its secession convention voted to leave the Union. The declaration that followed was clear and unambiguous. Slavery, it stated, was the greatest material interest of the world. The Union, Mississippi argued, no longer protected that interest. Florida followed soon after, then Alabama, then Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. By early February, 7 states had formally seceded from the United States. Each state held its own convention. Each debated its own resolution. But the language echoed from one declaration to the next: fear of federal power, loss of political control, and the future of slavery. Yet this was not a uniform movement. Inside these states, communities were divided. In some towns, crowds gathered to celebrate secession. Bands played. Speeches praised independence and Southern unity. In others, the mood was tense and uncertain. Many citizens worried about the economic consequences of leaving the Union. Southern trade depended heavily on Northern industry and international markets. Merchants feared disruption. Small farmers feared instability. Immigrants and enslaved people had no voice at all. Still, the political momentum was overwhelming. As one state after another left, pressure increased on those still undecided. No Southern leader wanted to be isolated, caught between a collapsing Union and a rising Confederacy. Meanwhile, the Upper South hesitated. Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas did not secede immediately. These states had fewer enslaved people and deeper economic ties to the North. Many hoped the crisis could still be resolved peacefully. But every new secession made that hope harder to sustain. In Washington, the situation deteriorated rapidly. The federal government still claimed authority over the entire nation. But in practice, its power was shrinking by the day. Federal troops were withdrawn from vulnerable positions. Customs duties went unpaid. Federal property in the South was seized without resistance. And still, no war. This absence of violence created a dangerous illusion. Some Americans believed the crisis might end quietly, through negotiation or delay. Others believed separation could occur without bloodshed. History would soon prove otherwise. By February 1861, the United States existed in name, but not in unity. Two visions of America now stood in open opposition, one rooted in a perpetual union, the other in the sovereignty of individual states. The dominoes had fallen. What began with one state's decision had become a regional break from the nation itself, and the center could no longer hold. As the Union unraveled, the country faced a dangerous reality. America had a president, but not a leader. James Buchanan still occupied the White House, yet his authority had all but vanished. His term was coming to an end, and his influence was already fading. More critically, Buchanan believed himself powerless to act. He held two conflicting views at once. He believed secession was unconstitutional, but he also believed the federal government had no legal right to stop a state from leaving. This contradiction paralyzed the nation at the worst possible moment. As Southern states withdrew, Buchanan urged calm. He appealed for patience. He hoped compromise might still preserve the Union. But compromise required leverage, and the federal government had very little left. Meanwhile, Abraham Lincoln waited. The president-elect remained in Illinois, bound by tradition and caution. He understood that every public statement carried risk. Too much force could push undecided states toward secession. Too much silence could be seen as weakness, so Lincoln chose restraint. Between November and March, the United States drifted without direction. Congress debated. Peace conferences were held. Proposals for new compromises surfaced and collapsed. None addressed the core issue dividing the nation. During this leadership vacuum, control over federal property became increasingly fragile. Across the South, U.S. forts, arsenals, and custom houses stood inside states that now claimed independence. Some were surrendered without resistance. Others were abandoned quietly in the night. The most critical of these was Fort Sumter, located in Charleston Harbor. Federal troops there were isolated. Supplies were limited. The fort stood as a symbol of federal authority in a state that rejected it. South Carolina demanded its surrender. Washington refused. Still, no shots were fired. The absence of violence masked the severity of the crisis. Many Americans clung to the hope that reason would prevail. that the Union could be restored without bloodshed. But beneath the surface, preparations were already underway. Southern militias drilled openly. State governments organized forces. Arms were gathered. Plans were made. By the time Lincoln prepared to take the oath of office, the nation he would inherit was already fractured. 7 states had left. A rival government was forming. Federal authority existed only where it could still be enforced. The presidency itself now carried a burden unlike any before it. When Lincoln finally arrived in Washington in late February, he did so quietly, amid threats and rumors of assassination. The capital itself felt uncertain, tense, divided, and watchful. The Union was still intact on paper, but in reality it was already slipping away. While the United States struggled with indecision, the seceded states moved quickly. They did not see themselves as rebels, they saw themselves as founders. In early February 1861, delegates from the 7 seceded states gathered in Montgomery, Alabama. Their goal was clear: to create a new nation before the old one could stop them. Within days, they drafted a provisional constitution. It closely resembled the U.S. Constitution, but with critical differences. Slavery was explicitly protected. States were given stronger guarantees of sovereignty. The right to own enslaved people was no longer implied. It was written directly into law. On February 9, 1861, the Confederate States of America officially came into existence. Jefferson Davis, a former U.S. Senator and Secretary of War, was chosen as its president. He was experienced, respected among Southern leaders, and deeply committed to their cause. Davis took the oath of office not in secrecy, but in public. Crowds gathered, speeches were delivered, the Confederate flag was raised. To its supporters, this was not an act of destruction, but of renewal. Across the South, celebrations erupted. Newspapers declared independence complete. Many believed the separation would be peaceful. Some even believed the North would accept the new nation without resistance. They were mistaken. In Washington, the creation of the Confederacy hardened Northern resolve. What had once been a constitutional crisis now looked like open defiance. 2 governments now claimed authority over the same territory. 2 presidents prepared to govern one divided land. Yet still, neither side wanted to fire the first shot. Both understood the consequences. If the Confederacy attacked federal property, it would appear as aggression. If the Union used force to suppress secession, it risked pushing more states away. This uneasy standoff defined the final weeks before war. As Confederate leaders organized their government, they also moved to secure their borders. State militias were consolidated into a Confederate army. Federal forts were surrounded. Supplies were cut off. Fort Sumter remained the most visible symbol of the conflict. A small federal garrison held out in Charleston Harbor, surrounded by Confederate forces. Its presence was a constant reminder that the crisis was unfinished. By the time Abraham Lincoln prepared to take office in March 1861, the Confederate States of America was no longer an idea. It was a functioning government, with an army, with territory, with a mission. The Union now faced a reality it could no longer avoid. By the time Abraham Lincoln took the oath of office on March 4, 1861, the United States existed in a strange and fragile state. The nation was divided, but the war had not yet begun. In his inaugural address, Lincoln spoke carefully. He avoided threats. He avoided celebration. Instead, he appealed to reason and restraint. He insisted that secession was illegal, but he also promised not to interfere with slavery where it already existed. Most importantly, he pledged to hold, occupy, and protect federal property, no more and no less. It was a narrow path, one meant to preserve peace without surrendering authority. Across the South, Lincoln's words were received with suspicion. Many Confederate leaders dismissed his reassurances as temporary. They believed federal power would eventually be used against them. Trust had already collapsed, and once lost, it could not be restored by words alone. Meanwhile, the Upper South remained undecided. Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas had not yet seceded. Their leaders watched closely, weighing loyalty to the Union against solidarity with the South. Their choice would depend on one critical factor: whether war came. Everywhere, Americans waited. Commerce slowed, travel became uncertain. Families argued, then fell silent. The country held its breath. At the center of this fragile calm stood Fort Sumter. The small federal garrison in Charleston Harbor was running out of food. Supplies would last only a few more weeks. Lincoln faced a decision that would define his presidency before it truly began. If he withdrew the troops, it would signal that the federal government accepted secession. If he sent reinforcements, it could provoke an attack. Lincoln chose a middle course. He informed South Carolina that supplies, not soldiers, would be sent to the fort. No weapons, no reinforcements, only food. The message was deliberate. If the Confederacy allowed the supplies through, peace might still be possible. If it stopped them by force, responsibility for war would rest clearly on Southern shoulders. Confederate leaders now faced a choice of their own: allow the fort to remain and admit federal authority still existed, or remove it and accept the consequences. By early April, the final threads holding the peace together were stretched thin. Two nations stood on the same soil. Two governments claimed legitimacy. Two armies waited. The war had not yet begun, but it was no longer avoidable. In early April 1861, the fate of the United States rested on a small brick fort in Charleston Harbor. Fort Sumter was not a battlefield. It was unfinished, lightly armed, and isolated. But symbolically, it carried the full weight of federal authority in a state that rejected it. Major Robert Anderson commanded the fort's garrison. His men were low on supplies. Morale was steady, but uncertain. They had been cut off for months, surrounded by Confederate forces that grew stronger each day. On April 10th, Confederate leaders issued a final demand: surrender the fort or face consequences. Anderson refused. He did so calmly, professionally, and without provocation. He knew that surrendering without orders would signal the collapse of federal authority. Yet he also knew his position was untenable. The next morning, before dawn on April 12, 1861, Confederate artillery opened fire. The first shots of the Civil War echoed across Charleston Harbor. For 34 hours, cannons roared. Shells arced through the sky. Walls crumbled. Smoke filled the air. Inside the fort, Anderson and his men fought not to win, but to endure. Ammunition was limited. Food was nearly gone. Still, the flag remained flying. Remarkably, no soldiers were killed during the bombardment, yet the absence of immediate casualties did not soften the moment. What mattered was not the destruction, but the decision. The choice had been made. On April 13th, Anderson surrendered Fort Sumter. As his men marched out, they saluted the American flag one final time. It was a gesture of dignity and farewell. News of the attack spread rapidly. In the North, shock turned to resolve. Public opinion shifted almost overnight. What had been a political crisis was now an armed rebellion. Lincoln responded within days. He called for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the insurrection and preserve the Union. That call changed everything. The Upper South now faced its moment of decision. Virginia seceded, then Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina. The nation split further, cleaner, harder, and more permanently. What had begun as a constitutional dispute had become a full-scale war. The final chance for peace had passed not with a treaty, but with a cannon shot. America had crossed the threshold, and there would be no turning back. The war did not begin with a grand declaration. It began with volunteers, men lined up in town squares and city streets. Some came out of loyalty, some out of anger, others out of fear of what would happen if they did not. Few imagined how long the war would last. Even fewer imagined how deadly it would become. In Washington, Lincoln faced a nation in pieces. He had inherited a conflict that no speech could undo. Preserving the Union now required force and sacrifice. In the South, Confederate leaders rallied support with promises of independence and honor. They believed the North would tire quickly. They believed victory would come swiftly. Both sides were wrong. The United States Army expanded almost overnight. So did the Confederate forces. Railroads carried troops instead of passengers. Factories turned to weapons. Farms emptied as sons marched away. The country transformed itself for war. What followed would be the bloodiest conflict in American history. More than 600,000 lives would be lost. Cities would burn. Families would fracture. The meaning of freedom would be tested in ways no generation before had faced. Yet, at the moment the war began, few could see that future. In April 1861, Americans still believed in a short struggle, a decisive victory, a return to normal life. They did not yet understand what they had unleashed. The Civil War would decide whether the United States could survive its own contradictions, whether a nation founded on liberty could endure while denying freedom to millions, whether compromise could hold, or whether violence would finish what politics could not. This was no longer a question of politics. It was a question of survival. Thank you for watching. If you found this piece of history compelling, please like this video and subscribe for more stories that shaped our world.